Dungeons & Dragons is collaborative storytelling. A group of players get together and act as new people within an imaginary world. With the game master as storyteller and the players as the main characters, the game simulates the feeling of being in a story, directing it, experiencing it. This is one common conception of what D&D is, and in this video I'm going to make the case that it is not well designed for that act. First, though, we need to figure out what I mean by design, and what D&D's design goals could be. In 2004, these lovely people, researchers and game designers both, wrote the Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics framework. The MDA framework attempts to give tools to game designers to formalize the consumption of games by breaking them into their distinct components: rules, system, and fun. In doing so, it establishes design counterparts to these experiences, which are therefore called Mechanics, Dynamics, and Aesthetics. For the purposes of this video, I'll be using the MDA framework. In particular, I'm interested in the aesthetics of play, which set out to describe some of the reasons people enjoy games. Let's break things down. People use all sorts of words to say they like a game. It's immersive, engaging, moving, satisfying, and least helpfully, fun. The thing is, none of that really explains why people like the games they play. For ttrpgs, it doesn't really matter what difference there is between a player being emotionally invested or having fun at the table. What matters is they'll be happy to come back to the next session. The aesthetics of play, therefore, give us more specific words to describe why people enjoy games. There's 8 of them, to which I'll give a very brief overview. Sensation, which is the game as sense pleasure, relates to the sights, sounds, and feelings we experience at the table. In the context of D&D, it's the joy of moving miniatures, hearing music, drawing maps, and most importantly, rolling dice. Fellowship, which is the game as social framework, relates to the cooperation and communication of the players at the table. In D&D, this is working together with your party, as well as camaraderie at the table, literally the feeling of being in a party. Challenge, which is the game as an obstacle course, relates to the fair problems which challenge the players. In D&D, this is the most straightforward. Combat, puzzles, and anything else that requires strategy or has stakes relates to challenge. Discovery, which is the game as uncharted territory, relates to finding mysteries or uncovering locations. In D&D, it's any kind of exploration or investigation. Expression, which is the game as self-discovery, relates to any creative endeavor. In D&D, that's character creation, backstory writing, or any creation that goes on in-game. Fantasy, which is the game as make-believe, relates to becoming immersed in a world which isn't real. In the context of D&D, it's the joy of a believable world, active role-playing, and maybe even getting into the mind of your character. Submission, which is the game as pastime, relates to any mindless or simple exercise. D&D and TTRPGs like it are pretty bad at this sort of thing because participation in the fantasy itself requires active thought. But casual play groups are a thing, and if your focus for playing is an excuse to hang out with your friends, that's submissive play, and nothing is wrong with that sort of play, to be clear. Narrative, which is the game as drama, relates to the joy of experiencing a well-told story. This one is what we're focused on in this video. It's beginning, middle, end plot. Characters with motives, a moving premise, a dramatic climax, all of that. When people talk about storytelling in their games, usually they're talking about narrative, with a bit of fantasy and expression thrown in. These aesthetics aren't the only way to explain how we enjoy games, and they aren't particularly rigorous or analytic in their nature. However, we're using them here as a tool to describe what the goals of game design can be, just to illustrate a point. First, let's talk about which aesthetics D&D uses. We can use the aesthetics to examine the behavior which 5th edition addresses. For example, let's study sensation. Lots of role-playing games value theater of the mind, that is, defining parts of the game purely in the imagination of its players. However, there are nearly always obstacles which fall out of that theater, that are necessary for the game to run. Character sheets are the best example of this, but things from which sense pleasure can be derived are what sensation desires. Rolling dice, for many people, is an inherently fun activity. Some people, however, prefer rolling physical dice to digital. That desire is related to the sensation aesthetic. People like the feel of dice in their hands, the sounds that they make while rolling, the tension while shaking a cup full of them. So, games that have rules which necessitate objects in play address sensation as an aesthetic. How does 5e do this? Well, characters move on a spatial grid, along with the many features and abilities which can refer to the grid. This encourages or even necessitates a map while playing, and miniatures on that map. That's sensation. It's a light framework, but plenty of people expand upon it, adding tokens, additional slips of paper for magic items, music playing in the background, and so forth. Therefore, D&D encourages sensation in a small but meaningful way, which influences its aesthetics of play. What other aesthetics does D&D address? Well, for one, fellowship. Dungeons & Dragons is based around a party dynamic, and the activities the party undertakes are often entirely collaborative. The classes are designed in such a way that they complement each other's strengths and weaknesses, and each has unique abilities that shine best in tandem with one another. Discovery and expression also have small parts to play in design. D&D enumerates several rules for overland travel and adventure encounters in the Dungeon Master's Guide, all of which encourage a discovery style of play. Uncovering loot is one of the major incentives baked into the gameplay. The thrill of opening a chest to discover a magic item, then having to attune to it so as to discover its effects, is a strong example here. Meanwhile, character creation is usually an expressive exercise. Pre-con characters are pretty rare, and the act of filling out a character sheet, choosing class and race, as well as background, are all creative exercises for the players. I won't mention the GM's role here, but obviously they are the primary enjoyer of expression as an aesthetic in D&D. Of course, all of what I just mentioned is somewhat tangential to the bulk of Dungeons & Dragons design. Characters are built, loot is discovered, parties work together, but all to what end? You might have seen this coming from a mile away. Dungeons & Dragons is designed as a game of challenge. Parties face enemies, traps, puzzles, dragons, dungeons, all as the main game mechanic. Every other activity revolves around that loop. Look at the character sheet. In terms of paper real estate, what do you see? Hit points, death saves, initiative, armor class, and movement speed are all specific to a state of combat. Most every class feature, too, are to be employed in combat or useful in the context of moving between combats, as in the case of the Ranger's party movement buff or any ability which conserves resources or heals HP. Inventories are populated by items like armor and weapons, potions of healing or heroism, and scrolls of fireball. Gold is usually spent in service of more combat, better armor, better weapons, powerful enchantments. Non-combat items like rope are also used to move between combats, address puzzles, and traps. Finally, the ability scores and skills. These bridge a gap between combat and the rest of the game because there's nothing specific about them that implies their exclusivity to combat. Except, skill tests are a part of combat. Just look at how athletics is treated for grappling. And the best predictor for the high statistic a character has is what ability score increases their 2-hit modifier. Constitution, meanwhile, is an ability entirely dedicated to increasing your hit points and resisting poisons through its saving throws. Consequently, choosing your Constitution as a dump stat is one of the least common practices in character creation, and a very bold choice. D&D is a wargame. It's been a wargame since its creation in 1974 as a departure from Chainmail, which was Gary Gygax's medieval miniature wargame. D&D carries that history forward, and ever since, its design has primarily expressed stakes for combat. People sometimes complain about min-max munchkins in their game or in the community at large, those people who optimize their characters for combat and ignore other key aspects of the game. But the point that I'm getting at is that there are no mechanical expressions for any of those aspects, like narrative, players might characterize as key to D&D. The few parts of the character sheet which do address storytelling and character, like alignment and bonds, are only words we write on a character sheet. Since the Paladin has had its alignment requirements removed, there have been no mechanical expressions for what those boxes even mean. That is absolutely impotent design, and regardless of whether or not you think it's a good or a bad thing, it speaks to a broader point. Nearly every other common element of the game, including but not limited to fantasy setting, social interactions, state spaces outside of the initiative order, and the creation of character relationships all hinge on invisible rules, the fiat of the GM of a particular table. This has borne a lot of fruit because people are incredible and creative storytellers, and D&D doesn't discourage storytelling through its rules. Indeed, I'd argue the reason it's so popular is that exciting combat is the premise for many amazing stories. Now, I like combat. In fact, I love combat, and I think that stories which focus upon combat are just as good as any other kind of story. But even so, the combat 5e presents is just one kind. Action movie style, with heroes who can get hit big and keep standing, with drawn-out conflicts, and with grand acrobatics and big explosions. You rarely ever see fast, lethal combat in 5e, where death saves are many and healing comes cheap. Game of Thrones style 1 second to lethality is a far cry away. And even more, all of that action presents the basis for just one type of story, one fragment of the human experience, and while exciting, the design of ttrpgs can have so much more to say. If you have a hammer, every problem is going to start looking like a nail. 5e gives the tools to perform combat and get loot. It's no wonder we invented the term murder hobo. Clever game masters and players can ameliorate these issues through their own solutions, but that's no excuse when there are so many other core systems out there. Powered by the Apocalypse frames storytelling as a conversation, and that core system makes certain that expression and fantasy are at the heart of its games. Vampire the Masquerade frames characters based on their bloodline and the connection they have to the world, similarly rooting people to the fantasy they inhabit. That's 2 popular examples, but there are 100 games that deserve 100 times the recognition they have. So, away from the earnest clickbait, here's the thesis. Dungeons & Dragons does not support storytelling through its design. It pigeonholes its campaigns towards a certain kind of behavior, and groups who wish to tell stories outside of that paradigm have to fight against the current and wrestle against the system's own instincts. And that's okay. Every game does this. Platformers want you to platform, puzzles want you to solve them, and war games want you to wage war. D&D is nothing new. It's the oldest RPG on the block. But that doesn't mean that it's what's right for you or the stories that you want to tell. Hey, this is my first video. If you like what I said or found it thought-provoking, I'd really appreciate your subscription. I enjoy talking about RPG theory, and so as long as there's an audience, I'll continue to make videos. Genuinely, thank you for watching.